In this episode, we speak with Dr. Bruce Blumberg, a professor of developmental and cell biology, as well as professor of pharmaceutical sciences and biomedical engineering at the University of California at Irvine. In this episode, we discuss his revolutionary research on the endocrine system and developmental effects of hormone-disrupting chemicals called obesogens. His research reveals startling epigenetic effects of exposure to hormone-disrupting chemicals in the environment. Chemicals which are found in common products from furniture to cookware, plastics, the food we eat, and even prescribed medications.
What your child is exposed to inside your womb can affect not only the child, but also your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren, and your great-great-grandchildren. We need to choose products that are safe, foods that are organic and fresh and wholesome, and personal care products that don't have chemicals that we prefer not to be exposed to in there. We need to be educated consumers, and they say practice a personal precautionary principle.
So join us as we discuss the very serious effects of obesogens and how these chemicals contribute to one of the greatest health threats, the obesity epidemic, as well as the health of future generations.
My name is Bruce Blumberg. I'm professor of developmental and cell biology, pharmaceutical sciences, and biomedical engineering at the University of California, Irvine. And by training, I'm a developmental biologist and molecular endocrinologist. And probably over the past 15 to 18 years, I've been working mostly on gene-environment interaction. So how do chemicals in our environment interact with our genetic and epigenetic composition to make us healthy or unhealthy? And the unhealthy that we work on is obesity.
So we're basically inundated by multiple untested and unregulated chemicals all the time. Tell us to what extent people are regularly exposing themselves to harmful chemicals.
The extent is actually quite high. So our environment and the food that we eat and the water that we drink and the air that we breathe and the products that we use in our homes and then we apply to our bodies are literally full of these sorts of chemicals that we call endocrine disrupting chemicals.
Mm-hmm.
But there are other kinds of toxicants as well. They're not all endocrine disruptors, but those are the ones I work on.
Mm-hmm. So I read quite some time ago now that it was estimated a large majority of people expose themselves to easily something like over 50 different kinds of chemicals every day, just by simply using common everyday products. That's quite a lot.
It is, and it's probably larger for women who tend to use more products.
Mm-hmm.
So makeup, but not just makeup, but skincare products, lotions and things like that. So you're quite young, so probably you're not heavily invested in that. But when you get older, lots of older women use anything they can to try to keep youthful skin. And lots of those products have endocrine disrupting chemicals and more than one.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So when I first read that, I was probably in my early 20s, and I've never really been a big makeup person to begin with. Certainly never a foundation wearer or things like that.
Mm-hmm.
But and today I don't wear any makeup.
Good for you.
And mainly it's because I'm super sensitive to chemicals around me. I can smell them. I can pick them up pretty easily. They really do bother me.
Mm-hmm.
When I read something like that, and I don't see any harm in discontinuing a potentially harmful product, I'm not going to go back to it, or I'm not going to start using it or whatever. So it's off the table for me. But I personally don't feel comfortable with the fact that people are essentially just long-term guinea pigs. It's incredibly violating.
Exactly.
The fact that there are so many different kinds of chemicals. Maybe you can give us an idea of just how many different kinds of chemicals there are that we commonly expose ourselves to.
So I can give you an idea with respect to endocrine disrupting chemicals. There's around about 1,000 chemicals that we know have effects on the endocrine system. Probably the largest majority of those are estrogens, but certainly not all. And as a woman, you probably know that your lifetime exposure to estrogen, so the area under the curve, affects your risk of breast cancer. So
Mm-hmm.
you don't need to be exposed to more estrogens than the ones that your body makes.
Just the sheer amount of endocrine or hormone disrupting chemicals in use, it's no wonder why we have so many chemicals found in our natural environment as well. One thing that drives me particularly nuts is our paper receipts. You can try to do the best you can to avoid as much plastic as possible by, say, using reusable shopping bags, but when you check out, you get handed a BPA coded paper receipt. It's pretty frustrating.
That's not what I would worry about. It's the constant exposure. And the people that are handing you those receipts, the BPA, it's just raw BPA on those that's used to develop the color, right? So when you heat it, it makes that dark color. That's why it's there. So it's actually getting directly into the bloodstream of those people that are handing you those receipts, the ones that are touching it all the time. So they're the highest exposed. And actually, the National Toxicology Program did a study of people, cashiers, people who handle those receipts a lot, and their blood levels were quite high compared with the general population. The insidious thing that you probably don't know about with BPA is all recycled paper products are full of BPA.
Mm.
Because where does the recycled paper come from? From offices mostly. And there's lots and lots of BPA, multi-part receipts, thermal this and that. You'd like to use recycled paper for the environment, but if you do that, you're exposing yourself to much higher levels of BPA than you would otherwise.
It just seems like everything is always undermined by something else in the system. It's just frustrating. I wanted to talk about just how truly invasive and violating these chemicals are. It's amazing that you can test women's breast milk, something as sacred as breast milk, and find that it's contaminated with these chemicals.
Lots of them.
I mean, when you find the most perfect food,
Mm-hmm.
developed through millions of years
Yes.
of evolution, contaminated,
Mm-hmm.
that's mind-blowing to me and
It is.
extremely violating.
It absolutely is. And the reason that's true is because many of these chemicals are stored in the fat in your body. And the two ways to mobilize fat in your body are to diet and to breastfeed. So when you breastfeed, the fat that goes into the milk comes from the fat stores in your body. That's why, when women who've gained a fair amount of weight during pregnancy, if they breastfeed, they'll lose the weight rapidly because that fat comes right off and goes into the breast milk because the baby needs it. But along with that fat comes everything that's stored there. So basically, your lifetime exposure to chemicals is being dispersed to your children through the most perfect possible food.
Mm. Well, let's talk about your research. Tell us just what obesogens are.
So obesogens it's a class of chemicals, so we made up the name, perhaps unwittingly. We just thought that a chemical that makes you fat should be called an obesogen. I never knew that the word wasn't used before that. So obesogens are chemicals that somehow make you gain fat. So they can do that directly by making more fat cells, bigger fat cells, or more efficient fat cells, or they can do that indirectly by affecting the regulation of appetite and satiety and metabolism in your body. So obesogen exposure can control your basal metabolic rate. And you may or may not know this, but your basal metabolic rate, the amount of calories your body burns when you're asleep, is actually 70% of your daily usage. So if you change that a bit, you're making a huge impact on how many calories your body needs.
Mm-hmm.
So obesogen exposure can affect that. It can also affect whether or not you feel hungry. So there are some drugs, some psychiatric drugs that are given to people, often for depression and for other things, and they'll make you fat. And they
Yeah.
do that, we think, by making you much hungrier.
So going back to just the amount of sources of these chemicals, from plastics to solvents, pesticides, herbicides, flame retardants, and even prescribed drugs, which you just mentioned. It's truly insane just how much we expose ourselves to.
Yes.
So I want to jump into the transgenerational effects that you've studied. Can you tell us a little bit more about the transgenerational and epigenetic effects of these endocrine disrupting chemicals?
So one of the very surprising and I guess frightening things about some endocrine disrupting chemicals and some obesogens is that they can have effects beyond the generation that's exposed. So, for example, you're a young woman. Let's say that you get pregnant. What your child is exposed to inside your womb can affect not only the child, but also your grandchildren, your great grandchildren, and your great great grandchildren. And Mike Skinner has actually gone 7 generations and shown that the effects persist. We've only gone to the F4 generation, which is the great great grandchildren. So that's really a scary thing, and it's never considered. So the regulatory agencies only consider short-term high-dose exposures.
Mm-hmm.
They never really look at long-term low-dose exposures. The kind of exposures that you and I face are never tested by the regulatory agencies, and they certainly never look beyond. They sometimes do what are called 2-generation toxicity studies, and they're looking basically, do the animals drop dead?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
No one is looking
which is
for
a shame
subtle
because
effects.
you're missing, the health of the living, what's going on with the living.
Yeah, of course. Well, and but that's their paradigm,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So that the chemicals should not cause people to drop dead in the streets, and they're doing a good job at that. People are not dropping dead in the streets from chemical exposures, but they're totally ignoring and not even investigating long-term chronic effects of the kinds of exposures that we face every day. So what they assert is that there's no effect without any evidence. They just said, look, you didn't die, so therefore there's no effect.
Which leads me to my next point here is these lead to non-communicable diseases. Can you talk a little bit about those?
Yes. So non-communicable diseases are the opposite of what we're facing now with the coronavirus. These are diseases, the coronavirus is a disease that's passed from person to person. So non-communicable diseases are conditions that you have or I have, things like obesity, type 2 diabetes, cancer. These are generally not communicable. And actually, they're the number one cause of death in the world today is non-communicable diseases. It's not things like coronavirus or Ebola or flu or pick any kind of nasty pathogen that you want. Those are not the number one cause of death in the world. It's chronic non-communicable diseases, heart disease, diabetes, cancer. These are the biggest causes of death in the world.
It's incredible that you do these studies on the transgenerational effects because my dad was a Vietnam vet who was exposed to Agent Orange.
Mm-hmm.
And on top of this, when I was growing up, there always seemed to be this war on nature mentality,
Yes.
Which I noticed in my own family. For instance, my aunt and my grandmother would use pesticides all the time. And my mom used those fumigating bombs.
Mm-hmm. The flea bombs, yes.
Yeah, I mean they were.
I used those too before I knew any better.
Yeah, they were common practice. Well, when I was around 17, I developed some strange symptoms, which I ended up living with for about a year and a half. And when I was 19, I was diagnosed with stage 4 lymphoblastic lymphoma.
Wow.
And, there wasn't any proof that said that my dad's exposure to Agent Orange could lead to this. But, there was only correlations, right? And I've always believed that there was a connection. And so I've always been so blown away by the fact that we continue to use so many chemicals the way that we do.
Mm-hmm.
It was an aggressive cancer. I beat it. I don't have
Excellent.
I'm not traumatized very easily.
Good.
So
Happy to hear that.
Thank you. I have such a sensitivity to chemicals. I'll walk down a grocery store aisle and a woman passes me and all I smell is like this wall of perfume and I'm just like, oh, gross.
My mom used to do that when I was a kid. We'd be going like a once a year special event, and she would like pour half a bottle of Chanel No. 5 on her so much that we were in the car, it just made my eyes water. I said, Mom, please. And she goes, but it's Chanel No. 5. It's very expensive. So let me tell you something about the Agent Orange thing, because actually, for no apparent reason, last year I got the report to review from the National Academy of Sciences. So there's a report every few years, and they send it out for peer review. And I looked at it and I was appalled. The reason that there are no data is because the government threw it all away
Yeah, well, what a
or they
surprise.
buried it deeply. So they say there's no evidence, but the government, especially the military, keeps the most maniacal records you can imagine.
Mm,
But everything related to Agent Orange, they got rid of, and all the
that's
others. It wasn't just
absolutely
Agent Orange. There
terrible.
were about six agent different colors: Agent Yellow, Agent Green. Agent Orange was just one of them.
It's just insane. Um, well, I'm curious about something, and I think it would be good to clarify what this means, this term forever chemicals. Can you kind of explain to our listeners what forever chemicals are?
That's a new word we're starting to hear with regard to perfluorinated chemicals. So chemicals, organic chemicals that are substituted with fluorines and chlorines and halides like that, they don't break down. They're not metabolized very effectively.
Mm-hmm.
So they're not the microbes don't break them down. Sunlight doesn't break them down to any great effect. They're extremely stable. So by forever, that means they're going to last for a very long time. So chlorinated pesticides like DDT, other things you've heard about like polychlorinated biphenyls, PCBs. These essentially, they don't last forever, but they last way more than a single lifetime.
And this includes things like the chemicals used in nonstick cookware, like Teflon,
Yes.
right? That are commonly used.
Mm-hmm. So it depends how you use it, right? So it's polymerized in the cookware, right? So it's not coming out unless you make it too hot. So if you get a nonstick that has these kind of chemicals too hot, and when I say too hot, I mean about 500 degrees
Yeah.
Fahrenheit, they start to smoke, and that's really toxic stuff that's coming off of them.
Isn't it crazy that we're using these products still that, if you heat it up too much, you'll kill your birds?
Yeah,
Like, why are we using these products in our
because we
homes?
don't know any better, or most people don't know any better. So yes, people that are educated that have done research and have read the literature know about it, but the average person doesn't know
Which
that.
is why we're having this episode. So I'd like to share this
Exactly.
information.
The people who don't buy Corona beer because of coronavirus, that's the ones
Right.
who are never going to figure this out.
It's a crazy world. There's so many aspects of what you write about and talk about in your research that's so interesting. What can you tell us about these very serious sex reversing effects of these kinds of chemicals?
So this chemical tributyl tin that we work on was first appreciated. Well, let me backtrack. So tributyl tin was first used as a biocide. So that means it's a chemical that prevents living things from growing. That used to be the case. Well, if you think about it, so large ships that travel the oceans, if you can imagine, lots of stuff in the ocean grows on the bottom of those ships. So if you go to the ocean, and you look at a dock at low tide, you can see lots of stuff growing on the pilings, right? That stuff grows on the bottom of ships too, and it makes them go much slower. It used to be the case that they put copper on the bottom of ship hulls, and copper is incredibly toxic to marine invertebrates. And at high dose, it's toxic to fishes too, but mostly it kills barnacles and clams and things that would stick to the hulls. So tributyl tin was first introduced in probably the 60s or 70s. I'm not sure exactly when, as a replacement for copper. And it was a terrific replacement for copper. So instead of killing everything, it had a much more mild effect. But one of the effects was very weird. What it did is made so snails are hermaphrodites. They have both
Yeah.
sexual parts. So they're both males and females, but they don't mate with themselves, right? They mate with other snails. So the male parts of one snail mates with the female parts of another snail and vice versa. And what tributyl tin is, it made the penis grow to colossal proportions. Imagine a guy with a penis as big as a telephone pole.
Mm-hmm.
That's not going to
That's
work,
not good.
right? Even though he might be happy, but it's not going to work for
Yeah.
mating. And it made the snails sterile and crashed the populations.
Wow.
I became interested in tributyl tin. I was working on endocrine disrupting chemicals and how they could be metabolized differently in different organisms. That's another area that we worked in. And I was at a meeting in Japan, and most of the meeting was in Japanese, so I was, jet lagged and zoning out because I don't speak Japanese. But one guy spoke in English, and it happened to be he talked about tributyl tin sex reversing fishes.
Mm-hmm.
So, by training, I'm a vertebrate developmental biologist. So I'm interested in how the vertebrate embryo develops and how it's patterned and things like that. I didn't care so much about snails, except Okay, that's an interesting phenomenon. And he said the tributyltin could sex reverse genetically female Japanese flounder. So fish that would be 100% female and treated them with tributyltin, and 30% of them became male,
Wow.
functional males. I said, whoa, that's interesting. And we were already testing tributyltin on another hormone receptor that regulates the breakdown of chemicals. And I called the lab and I said, guys, test tributyltin on all of the receptors that we have in the lab. And we expected that it worked on a sex steroid receptor, right? So if you want to sex reverse, a frog or a fish, you can give testosterone or you can
Right.
give estradiol, and that will cause them to become all males or all females, irrespective of what genetic sex says. So we tested it on hormone receptors, and we expected that it would activate a steroid receptor. Instead, we found that it activated two receptors that were very important for the development of fat cells, ARXR and PPAR gamma, which work together to regulate the development of fat cells. So, what do you do with that result? We decided to study that further and got involved in this whole idea of chemicals and obesity, which was in 2004, it was heresy. Just, I never forget the first grant I ever wrote on this topic. One of the reviewers wrote, "How dare you waste our time with such a ridiculous idea that chemicals can cause obesity? Everyone knows that diet and exercise are responsible for obesity." Now, 16 years later, we know that there is an impact of chemicals on obesity. So my mice, whose great great grandmothers were exposed when they were pregnant, get fat on a slightly higher fat diet than animals whose great great grandparents weren't exposed to tributyltin. And we didn't do anything else to these animals. Just they were 4 generations ago, they were exposed to tributyltin, a low dose like you and I are exposed to. And those babies got fat when they were on a slightly higher fat diet.
Wow.
I'm not talking about when people do those kind of experiments, they often give mice food that's basically lard,
Yeah.
which is a bizarre diet for a mouse. We just increased the fat from 13% to 20%, and those animals got obese within a week after switching the diet. That says that there's an impact of this ancestral exposure to an obesogen, and it interacts with diet,
That's crazy.
right? So without the increased fat in the diet, the animals got a little bit fatter, but it wasn't dramatic. But as soon as we upped the fat in the diet, they got obese in a week.
Wow.
And they stayed obese. And when we switched them back to the normal diet, they didn't lose the weight. The metabolism of these animals was permanently changed. So we say that was originally described by a guy named David Barker as a thrifty metabolism. So that means that the animals who were exposed to that, whose great great grandparents were exposed to that obesogen, tend to store more of the calories they eat as fat. So now let's imagine that in human terms. Let's say you and your sister, just as for the sake of argument, if you had a sister, I don't know if you do, and you were exposed when your mom was pregnant and she wasn't. Otherwise, you're genetically very similar. What that means is that obesogen exposure is going to make you more likely to gain weight and less likely to lose weight on the same diet. So your baseline is going to be different. If you think about it as a thermostat, right? Let's say the thermostat is set at 80 degrees, and you can change the effect. You can make the room hotter or cooler by opening the window, but as soon as you close the window, it's going to go back to the set point. So what that means in human terms is you can fight that battle, right? You can work hard and lose the weight. But unless you make it a lifestyle change, you'll go back to where you were. And that's exactly what we see with obese people, right? There's this show called The Biggest Loser, and people compete to lose weight. I don't know if it's still on, but a study was done of those people and was found even people that work hard, right? They lose 100, 150 pounds, and they've worked and sweated and dieted to do that. And now they're looking in the mirror and they say, wow, I'm so happy with how I look and feel. They all gain the weight back. Why would that be? It's a programming. So the chemical exposure reprograms your body in a permanent way so that you will be predisposed to gain more weight and lose less weight on the same diet as somebody who was not exposed.
So your metabolism is what's permanently altered.
Yes. We've done that in animals. The study's been done in humans. And I know two of the middle authors on the study. I can never remember the guy's name whose lab it was. But what they did is they put people in a clinic and they put them on a diet and made them lose weight. And then they let them eat normally again and watched how fast they gained weight. And it turned out that the people who lost the least weight and gained weight back the fastest had the highest levels of perfluorinated chemicals in their blood,
Oh,
the forever
yeah.
chemicals. And they had a lower resting metabolic rate.
Yeah.
So it means that their bodies were programmed already to use less calories. Normally, when you go to a doctor, he says, okay, Soraya, I don't know, you're 5'5" and you weigh 120 pounds, and therefore you should eat this many calories. But no, it depends on more than that. So you need to have your basal metabolic rate tested so you know this is how many calories my body needs to sustain itself. And then you add a certain amount on top of that to compensate for how active you are. And that's how much you should eat.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
height and weight is only part of it. It's a crude estimate. You need to measure that because we're all different.
Yeah. Those are pretty startling effects. So what kind of advice do you have for people to reducing their exposure to these chemicals?
So the simplest way is that we take personal action so that in our own lives, we try to reduce the exposures that we have. So there's several ways to do that. Job one is the food that you eat. And if you don't do anything else, you got to do that. And by that, I mean you need to go to the market and buy fresh food and prepare your meals from that. So whole, fresh foods is job one. Then you miss everything that comes from the processing and packaging, and there's plenty there. If those foods are organic, so much the better. So whole, fresh, and organic is the best you can do. Job number two, after cleaning up your food, is to get plastic out of your life as much as possible. And that's not just good for you, it's good for the environment because all the plastic that we use ends up in the middle of the ocean. Right? We have these giant plastic garbage patches in the ocean. That's just the macroplastics. Now the microplastics that we're using, the cleansing stuff in the scrubs,
Gross.
that's absolutely necessary according to, the cosmetic industry. That stuff ends up in the food that we eat, right? It goes into the ocean and it gets taken up and goes right up the food chain.
Yeah, it's pretty frustrating, and I know this pandemic changes things. The COVID-19 pandemic, not the chemical pandemic. Although maybe we should really stress that
For
there is
sure.
a chemical pandemic.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
That one's
yeah.
not going away
Sadly.
anytime soon.
But what I was getting to are bulk bin stores in America. I mean, why aren't they the normal thing at this point?
Yeah.
I was also going to say that I think the pandemic has changed some of the protocols on reusables right now, but don't give up on reusables.
Hmm.
Just you might live near a co-op that you're used to using reusables, and at this moment in time with the health crisis, we might not be able to be utilizing our reusables at this time, but please don't give up on those. With all of the knowledge that we have about chemicals in our environment and the harms of plastic,
Yeah.
it's just still amazes me what we're still doing. For instance, where I live, the majority of the stores offered only paper bags, but just recently, like within the last few months or so, the local Walmart reintroduced plastic bags only.
How thoughtful of them.
So that's the norm around here again. And it's just mind blowing that at this point in time, with all that we know, why are these allowed to be brought back?
Because they're banned in California is why. They got to sell them somewhere.
Yeah, and you can see the effects immediately. Like they're on
Hmm.
the side of the
Yes.
road.
Blowing around. Yeah,
Yep, I mean they're in the environment already.
I know. But the worst thing, you go to these stores that have bulk foods and bins, and what kind of containers are there next to those bulk bins for you to put the stuff in?
Plastic.
Plastic. I think the most important thing is that people have to understand that it's up to us to change the way things are. The government's not going to ban these pesticides and herbicides. That happens only very slowly and with great effort, and then they're immediately substituted with a different one that works almost the same way. Right? You ban BPA, and now comes BPS and
Yep.
BPF. You ban DDT, and then comes chlorpyrifos. You ban chlorpyrifos, then comes something else. So we need to make our own choices, and we need to choose products that are safe, foods that are organic and fresh and wholesome, and personal care products that don't have the chemicals that we prefer not to be exposed to in there. We need to be educated consumers, and I say practice a personal precautionary principle. So When in doubt, get it out. So if you don't know whether something's safe or not, better not to expose yourself. Where the industry position is the opposite. Unless you're 100% sure that it's dangerous, you should think it's safe. So it may make sense to have a beyond a reasonable doubt standard in the criminal law, but it doesn't make any sense to have that in the chemical law. And the chemical law is actually worse. It's not beyond a reasonable doubt. It's to a substantial certainty that a product is harmful to humans before it can be banned. And I always ask lawyers, how many cases could you win if the standard of proof was to a substantial certainty? And the answer is not so many.
Interesting.
That's the chemical law. So we're not going to change the law easily, but we can change how we behave.
Yeah. Which will shift everything else if we can all get on board. I guess another thing
just look at how many organic foods have appeared in your life, right? So you said you're 33. When you were 19, how easy was it to go to the market and get organic stuff?
It was a little different.
How prevalent was it? You had to work hard to find it.
It's very interesting because, of course, lots of people now really do have an understanding of what's going on, but yet it's still not the default. Like, why isn't organic produce just simply the default practice? We have already known for some time that these chemicals do not produce greater yields, and yet they're still widely used.
Dispelled by scientists, not dispelled by the guys who show up at the farm store and say, you're growing corn. We have this product that's going to be so great for you, that's going to make you have more better corn, and you're going to use less water and blah, blah, blah. So that's what they do. And they tell people, for example, they told us that making Roundup ready crops would Roundup. And in fact, the rate of use has gone up 200-fold since the introduction of those. So we're not getting the truth. Farmers are being misled by agribusiness.
Oh, for sure.
I think farmers don't want to destroy the land. In many cases, farmers have lived on their families have lived and farmed that land for generations. So they don't want to destroy it. They're just doing what they're told is a good thing.
Yeah.
And the reality is the family farm is pretty much gone. When, with the interest rate crisis before you were born in the 70s, when Jimmy Carter was president, interest rates went up to 21. My first car loan, the interest rate was 21.5%. And that bankrupted family farms, and they were all bought up by Archer Daniels Midland. Is now basically the big agribusiness, and there are others like that. So that's the farmers here. It's not, your grandpa farming anymore. There's very little of that, and that's a shame.
Yeah, there's still this false sense that farmers are the ones who understand ecology and the land really well. But obviously, that's not the case with these large agribusiness farming, like you were saying.
I think that's right.
So we're just inundated by the industry's push for these chemicals, which I think should be held criminally responsible. Because at this point, even when we do buy organic produce, we cannot be guaranteed that they're free of chemicals because of how widely these chemicals are used.
You may have seen the Environmental Working Group just came out with their Dirty Dozen and Clean 15 for this year.
Yeah, I did actually see that.
Yeah, and even organic fruits and vegetables had some residues because it's blowing there from the regular fields.
Yes.
The thing that people don't understand is if there's a conventional farm on one side of the street and there's an organic farm on the other side of the street, the stuff blows in the wind. It doesn't stay where you put it, and it blows on the dust, and it gets into the groundwater.
Right, exactly. Well, what can you tell us about the epigenetic effects of environmental exposure to these chemicals?
The first person that did this work was a guy named Mike Skinner at Washington State, who showed that exposure to a very high dose of a fungicide called vinclozolin could cause effects 4 generations later. And the idea of inheritance that doesn't work by changing the genes is heresy, to be perfectly honest, right? So that's, if you remembered in your genetics classes, you learned about Darwin and Lamarck. And Lamarck was this crazy guy who believed that you could have the effects of things that happen in your life passed on to the next generation.
Right.
And he picked a bad example, right? Of the antelope stretching its neck to become a giraffe. So that obviously didn't happen and can't happen. However, if you're exposed to a chemical And that chemical affects your germ cells without causing a mutation, right? So you can cause a change in the nucleotide sequence of your genes, and that's the typical way that geneticists think about heredity. You make a mutation, or there's background, genetic diversity in the population, and the environment acts on that, and you get a change in the population over time. So that's of course true. But how about if you affect whether a gene's expressed or not? So I'll pick an example of melanoma. There's a tumor suppressor gene called P10, and if that's mutated so that it doesn't work, you can get a predisposition to melanoma. However, if you methylate the promoter of the P10 gene a very lot, we call that hypermethylating, then the gene's not expressed. So that's no different, right? You express a mutated gene that doesn't work, or you don't express the gene at all, same effect, no tumor suppressor gene. And it turns out that some of those effects can be transmitted to the next generation. Methylation, that's a little controversial, because in mammals, methylation is erased every generation in the formation of the germ cells. But there are other things we know. We expose a pregnant mouse to a low dose of tributyltin in their drinking water, and then we see effects 4 generations later. And because of the way we did the experiment, there is zero possibility that there was a genetic mutation that's transmitted. So this is an epigenetic change.
Right.
So we changed something that was passed to the next generation.
Mm-hmm.
So the biggest topic of interest in my lab is to understand what changes happened in the germ cells of the animals that were exposed that was passed to future generations. And we think that what we did is we changed the 3-dimensional structure of what's called chromatin in the nucleus. But that has a spatial organization, and how it's organized affects which genes are expressed when and where. So we have evidence that demonstrates that we changed the structure, and that altered structure is passed from one generation to the next. The question that we need to answer is, what exactly did we change, and how was that passed to the next generation? And until we prove that, the geneticists are still going to say, that sounds pretty Lamarckian to us. We don't buy that. But the effects are real. So the question is, how do we explain them? And that's what we're working on. And when that's explained, that will cause a revolution in biology.
Epigenetic.
This idea that epigenetic inheritance is also very important. And the two collaborate together. So the changes in the genes and the variation in the sequence of genes in a population, and also the variation in the epigenome, how those genes are expressed, both are important. And it makes sense that evolution would want to work that way. I mean, evolution is not a directional process. It just happens. But organisms should have both fast and long-term responses. So the fast response is going to be the epigenetic response. And then the longer-term response will be the genetic and the epigenetic, the combination of those. So that's where we're headed, and it'll happen in your lifetime. Might not happen in mine, but it'll happen in yours for sure.
Well, thank you so much for the work that you do. It is truly not only revolutionary, but really needed. And I just really thank you. Before we close up today, I'd like to ask you my final question, which is, if you can share a story about a special experience or connection that you have made in nature or with an animal.
With an animal, probably. So I had a cat who for 17 years slept on my neck and purred me to sleep every night.
Mm-hmm.
And I sure miss her.
Oh, thank you so much. And just one last thing. Tell us just a little bit about your book.
I wrote a book for the general public to understand these topics. It's called The Obesogen Effect. Been out for almost 2 years now. And I try to explain all these concepts in a way that the interested person who's not a scientist can understand.
I just really want to thank you, Dr. Blumberg, for your research.
Thank you.
It's truly interesting to me, and I have a bit of a fascination with epigenetics, and I just really appreciate the work that you're doing. It's super important. Thank you so much.
Thanks for your interest.
During these strange times with the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, we all have a lot of time to consider what is absolutely essential, focusing on what matters most to all of us in order to stay healthy, like consuming good, nutritious food and avoiding harmful chemicals. We are, after all, in an ongoing chemical pandemic. After we get through and overcome the COVID-19 pandemic, hopefully we will carry out our lives not as before, but with a greater awareness of what is truly essential, and renounce the use of products which harm not only ourselves, but our future children and their future generations. And we can carry out these changes right now. If you would like to learn more about the effects of obesogens in our environment and how to avoid them, check out Dr. Blumberg's book, The Obesogen Effect. This is Wild Roots. Thanks for listening.